The orc lived in chains, treated as nothing, until a widowed farmer appeared and took her away without saying a word. Everyone thought it would be the same fate, but what he did next, no one expected, and it would change everything forever. The sun over the iron borderlands had no mercy. It fell vertical, dry, relentless, like everything else in that place. Dust clung to skin. The smell of manure and stale sweat filled the air of the makeshift pen where the slaves were put on display. Rotting wood, rusted chains. And in the deepest corner, almost hidden from sight, there she was, Shagrat, 23 years old. Olive green skin, eyes the color of old copper. Athletically built, like all female orcs. No tusks, but with a presence that, in other circumstances, would have drawn attention for strength, not misery. Here, though she was invisible, that was what they wanted her to be. She didn't cry. She had learned early that tears drew attention, and attention in that place never came with kindness. The chain on her ankle weighed less than what she carried inside. 3 years. 3 years since the men of the southern frontier had raided the Veshran clan's camp and taken those who survived. She had been one of them. She had watched the fire consume the tents. She had seen the clan shaman fall with a rifle shot to the chest. She hadn't screamed that night either. She'd learned before that. Screaming changes nothing. It only wears you out. That morning she had been working since before sunrise, carrying water buckets from the well to the main house, 2 buckets at a time, the wooden handle marking calluses over calluses. The overseer, a short man with a yellowed moustache and small eyes, walked behind her with a bamboo cane. He didn't need to use it. The threat was enough. "Faster, Green. You're not decoration." She didn't answer. She never answered. Inside the main house, the owner's wife was shouting at a human servant for leaving a stain on the tablecloth. The owner smoked on the porch, indifferent to the world. 2 of his sons ran through the yard, throwing rocks toward the pen. One of the rocks hit Shagrat on the shoulder. She didn't even turn around. The overseer laughed, a short, empty laugh that didn't need a reason. In the afternoon, when the well work was done, other chores came. Clean the stable, carry hay, mend fences under the sun. Her body ached in a way that was no longer sharp. It was dull, constant, like a companion that never left. Food, when it came, was whatever was left over from the day before. Sometimes hard bread, sometimes nothing. She ate what she had and stayed quiet. At night, in the pen, there were 3 others. 2 humans from distant regions, too old for heavy labor, and a male orc named Throck, younger than her, who still had the flame of hatred in his eyes. He had tusks like all orc men, thick, slightly curved, and he kept his jaw tight most of the time, like someone holding back words that had nowhere safe to go. He whispered escape plans that never came to anything. "One day," he would say. "One day," she'd repeat without believing it. But it was what you said. It was what kept something alive in the chest. Shagrat lay down on the dry hay, stared up at the cracked wooden ceiling. Outside, the stars of the iron borderlands blinked cold and distant. She knew them by heart. She had memorized them during the nights at the Veshran camp, when the shaman said they were the eyes of the ancestors. She wasn't sure she believed that anymore, but she looked at them anyway. They were the only things no one could put in chains. She closed her eyes and waited for another day to end. What she didn't know was that very night, on the other side of the frontier, a man was rehearsing a decision that would change both their fates. The notice was nailed to the tavern door, with 3 rusted tacks. Sale, final lot, Korea property, Saturday. Nobody read it with any real interest. It was the kind of thing that happened at the end of a debt cycle, when an owner couldn't pay his creditors anymore and needed to liquidate whatever was easiest. Cattle, tools, and those who were considered neither one nor the other. Shagrat was led to the center of the village with the other three. The morning was already hot. A dry wind moved dust through the street in slow spirals. Men gathered around the makeshift square, some out of genuine interest, most out of habit. Throck was the first to be sold, fast. A merchant from Greystone bought him without even looking properly. He just wanted arms to haul rocks in the mine. Throck was led away with a rope around his wrist, and he didn't look back. Shagrat watched until he disappeared around the corner of the stable. The two old humans went together. A farmer bought them both with what appeared to be pity, but Shagrat knew that pity was rarely the real reason for anything in these lands. Then it was her turn. The overseer yanked the chain. She walked to the center of the makeshift space, a square of packed dirt, ringed by men in hats and dust. Some looked on with indifference, others with a darker curiosity, the kind that made her skin feel like it didn't belong to her. "Female orc," the overseer announced with no enthusiasm. "Strong, works well, no complaints." Silence. "Anyone opening?" More silence. A man at the back spat on the ground. Another said something low that made his neighbor laugh. Shagrat stood still, eyes fixed on some neutral point on the horizon. She had learned not to look at faces. Human faces in these situations rarely had anything useful to offer. "Nobody?" the overseer pressed, irritation sharpening his voice. "How much do you want?" A voice came from the right, different from the others, low, direct, no irony. Shagrat moved her eyes slowly in that direction. A man of around 40, maybe more, tall, dry as a winter branch, wide-brimmed hat, dark coat worn at the edges, the face of someone who had worked under the sun for decades, deep lines, closed expression. He didn't look rich. He didn't look cruel. He looked tired in a way that went deeper than one bad night. He wasn't looking at her with the slow assessment the others did. He was just waiting for the overseer's answer. The overseer named a price. The man didn't haggle. He pulled coins from his coat pocket, counted them in his own palm, and handed them over without ceremony. "Done," he said. The overseer passed the chain to the man. The man looked at the chain for a second. Then he looked at Shagrat. "Can you walk?" he asked. She didn't answer, just stared at him. "I'll take that as a yes," he said, and coiled the chain loosely in his hand without pulling it. Then he turned and walked toward the horse tied to the post. Shagrat followed. She had no choice. But there was something different about that moment. He hadn't pulled the chain, hadn't given an order. He'd asked a question, a small question, almost inconsequential, but it was the first one anyone had asked her in 3 years. She climbed into the wagon. He took the reins. The village disappeared behind them in the dust, and Shagrat looked at the road ahead without knowing where she was going, only knowing that this man's silence didn't carry the same weight as all the other silences she had known. Still, the fear stayed. The road to the farm took nearly 2 days. The man didn't speak. Neither did she. The wagon creaked over dry gravel. The horse, an old roan, patient, followed the path as if he knew it by heart. The sun sank behind the mountains of Shadow Green Canyon on the first afternoon, and the sky turned a heavy purple that looked like a wound on the horizon. Shagrat observed everything. That was what she did when she didn't understand a situation. She catalogued details. The man had no whip marks on his hands. The hands of someone who beats carry calluses in a specific pattern. His were calloused, but from hoe and rain. He had a long scar on his left wrist. The holster of his revolver was worn, but the weapon looked well kept, like someone who used it rarely but always maintained it. He didn't seem like a man of easy cruelty. But she had been deceived before. On the first night, they stopped near a stream. He lit a fire without asking for help. He pulled 2 strips of dried meat from the saddlebag and tossed one in her direction without a word. She caught it in the air, ate slowly, watching the fire. He ate on the other side of the flames, also watching the fire. When he finished eating, he took a blanket from inside the wagon and set it on the ground at a respectful distance, close enough to the fire to be warm. "It'll get cold," he said only. Then he lay down on the other side, using the saddle as a pillow, and closed his eyes. Shagrat stayed awake for hours. She waited for the moment the trick would be revealed. She kept her back against the wagon wheel, eyes open in the dark, ears tuned to any movement. He slept. He snored lightly once, turned onto his side, went still. She waited a while longer, then, from exhaustion, let her eyes close. On the second day of travel, the silence continued, but its texture had changed. It was no longer the heavy silence of the first day, full of dark possibilities she kept turning over like stones. It was just silence, like two people sharing a road without owing each other anything. When they neared a fork, he said, "My name is Edmund." He didn't ask for hers. She looked at the road ahead. "Shagrat," she said after a moment. He nodded as if it were practical information, and nudged the horse to keep going. The farm appeared at the end of the second afternoon, a simple dark wood house, a barn behind it, a vegetable garden on the side, a low wooden fence, repaired in patches. No grandeur, no pretense, no other workers visible. Shagrat climbed down from the wagon slowly, looking around, calculating exits, distance to the road, where the tools were kept, where the horse would sleep. Edmund unhitched the animal in silence, led it to the barn, came back with empty hands. He stood a few steps from her. "You're waiting for me to tell you to do something," he said. It wasn't a question. She didn't answer. "There'll be time to talk about how things work here," he said. "For today, just rest." He went inside. The door stayed open. Shagrat stared at that open door for a long moment. Then she looked at the road she'd come from, then back at the door, and went inside. The next morning Edmund made 2 plates. Shagrat woke in the room he had indicated, a small space with a plank bed and a straw mattress, but clean, swept floor, a window latch that worked, no chain, no lock, no one sleeping across the threshold to keep her in. She sat on the edge of the bed for a while, listening. No raised voice, no boots moving fast. Nothing that sounded like preparation for something bad. She came downstairs slowly. He was facing away from her, stirring eggs over the fire. 2 plates on the table, 2 cups of water. "Sit," he said without turning. She stayed near the door. He served both plates, placed one in front of the empty chair, and sat across from it. He began to eat without looking toward the door. No performance of patience. He just ate. Shagrat walked to the table, sat at the very edge of the chair, tense as a bowstring. Eggs, a piece of dark bread, a thin slice of cheese. The eggs were still warm. She ate. When he finished, he wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and said, "You're not a slave here." She raised her eyes to him for the first time in 2 days. "I don't understand," she said. "You don't need to understand right now," he answered. "You just need to know." He pushed back his chair, stood, walked to the door. "I'm going to tend to the barn. If you want to help, you can. If you don't have to." And he left. Shagrat stared at the closed door. "You're not a slave here." 6 words, simple words. But inside her, something contracted. Not from fear. From something she didn't recognize well, something that hurt in a different way, like a muscle that had been still too long and was trying, against its own resistance, to move again. She washed her own plate, then washed his too without thinking much about it. She stood by the kitchen window for a while, watching Edmund enter the barn. He didn't look back to see if she was following. Didn't send anyone to watch. The front door was unlocked. The road was visible from where she stood. She could go. Nothing was stopping her from going. And precisely because of that she didn't. Not yet. Not because she trusted him. She didn't. But the cruelest trap that existed was false freedom, and she needed to understand what was in front of her before making any move. By late afternoon, she went to the barn. Edmund was fixing a broken plank. He didn't look up when she came through the door. "Need help?" she asked. He gestured toward a pile of nails with his chin. She crouched down and began sorting the large ones from the small ones. Fingerwork, quiet between them. The quiet of two people doing something instead of waiting. No orders, no threat. And yet she was there, working. Only this time, for the first time in 3 years, she was the one who had shown up. Nobody had sent her. Edmund woke before the sun. Shagrat learned that in the first few days. She heard his footsteps on the floorboards of the hallway, the back door, the bucket hitting the stone lip of the well. She lay still each morning, listening, mapping the rhythms of the house the way she had once mapped the rhythms of the pen, learning what was normal so she could recognize when something wasn't. He had predictable routines. Well, barn, garden. When she didn't appear for meals, he made no comment, no punishment. She tested that. On the 3rd day, she stayed in her room until mid-morning. Nothing. On the 5th day, she pulled carrots from the garden without asking. Nothing. On the 7th day, she walked to the far fence by the tree line and stood there for an hour. When she came back, he was on the porch mending a bridle strap. "There's bread in the kitchen if you want," he said. She studied him the way she studied terrain. Every detail. He drank an herbal infusion in the morning, not spirits. He didn't smoke. He didn't raise his voice, not even at the horse when it was difficult. He had no friends who came to visit. On the living room wall, there was a framed photograph. She had noticed it on the 2nd day and studied it carefully on the 3rd. A dark-haired woman with light eyes and a restrained smile. A small boy standing in front of her. 4 years old, maybe. Serious face the way children get when they're trying to hold still for something. They were posed in front of what looked like this same house when the fence had been newer. Edmund never mentioned it. She didn't ask. But she noticed that he paused in front of it sometimes, just a beat, then moved on. She still expected the violence. She couldn't reason it away. 3 years of cruel learning had built reflexes that didn't respond to logic. Every unexpected movement made her harden. Every time he came near without warning, something old and automatic tightened in her chest. He seemed to sense it. He began announcing himself before appearing. A light cough at the corner, a quiet going past you before moving in her direction. Small warnings. She noticed. She said nothing, but she noticed. In the 2nd week, she began tending the vegetable garden without being asked. Most plants she recognized, root vegetables, hardy herbs, but along the southern edge, half buried in weeds, there were yellow flowers she knew from something older. Vesh ran flowers. The clan used them for healing tea, for the smoke that accompanied the shaman's work. She'd not seen them in 3 years. She crouched down and cleared the weeds around them carefully, one by one. Edmund walked past later that afternoon and stopped when he saw what she was doing. "You know what those flowers are," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," she said, without looking up. "From your clan?" She paused, looked at him sideways. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "Take care of them," he said. "They're good," and went back to work. Shagrat stayed crouched in the dirt for a moment after he left. Something had shifted, something small and almost imperceptible, like a door that had been stuck for years, moving a single inch. Not open, not yet, but no longer entirely sealed, like a wound that begins, very slowly, to close. Time passed the way it does when you stop counting days. Shagrat stopped calculating weeks. She started calculating harvest cycles, moon phases, scars that were healing. The garden grew. The barn got its broken plank replaced. And then a section of roof that had been letting in weather. The back fence that had been leaning now stood straight. She didn't do any of it out of obligation. She did it because there was something satisfying about seeing broken things become whole, about having hands occupied with something that didn't cost anyone anything. Edmund worked alongside her most days. He wasn't a talker. He didn't fill silence with words the way some people did, nervously, as if quiet were a thing to be afraid of. He worked steadily and let things be what they were. She found she preferred that. One morning she was kneading bread at the kitchen table. She'd taught herself by watching his hands, then trying alone, then trying again, and when he came through the back door with a rabbit he'd caught on the ridge. "Good," he said, noticing the bread. "It'll take a while," she answered. "Everything worth it takes a while," he said, and set the rabbit on the counter. That evening they ate together properly for the first time, not 2 plates set out with the stiff courtesy of strangers, but 2 plates of food that both of them had made. He said the bread was very good. She said the rabbit was seasoned wrong. He laughed. It was the first time she'd heard him laugh. Short, quick, almost surprised at itself, like a sound that escaped before he could hold it back, like someone who had forgotten he was capable of it. She didn't laugh, but the corners of her mouth moved. A few days later, a traveling merchant arrived. Oscar was old and perpetually in motion. He climbed down and looked around the yard with the evaluating eyes of a man who noticed everything. His gaze landed on Shagrat and stayed a second too long. "New worker?" he asked Edmund. "Shagrat," Edmund answered without qualification, without explanation or apology. Oscar waited for more. Edmund gave nothing more. The old merchant accepted his coins, muttered something to himself, and climbed back onto the wagon. When his dust had settled back into the road, Shagrat said, "He'll talk in the village." "Probably," Edmund agreed. "That's going to cause trouble." He was quiet for a moment, looking down the road where Oscar had gone. His expression wasn't worried. It was the look of a man who has already done his calculation and made his choice. "Already is," he said, and added nothing more. There was something in the plainness of it, in the way he didn't perform resignation or bravery. He had just said the truth the way you state the weather. That week, he came back from a supply run with a piece of leather and left it on the kitchen table without explanation. Good leather, thick, well-tanned, the kind that would last for years. She looked at the leather, then at him. "For whatever you want," he said, and went back outside. She sat with it for a long time after he left, turning it in her hands. It was the first thing anyone had given her in 3 years without a price attached. The rider arrived on a very hot afternoon, when the air sat heavy and still, and even the birds had gone quiet in the heat. Shagrat was in the garden when she heard the hoofbeats. 3 horses, 3 men. The first had the Frontier Council's emblem stitched to his shoulder. Edmund came out of the house before they reached the fence. "Edmund Varn," the first man said without dismounting. "People are talking in the village." "People always talk," Edmund replied. "They're saying you've got an orc living here, free." "Free is a word people use for what they don't understand," Edmund said. The man's eyes moved to Shagrat, that long, measuring look. She stood still, didn't shrink, looked back at him steadily, which she knew made men like him uncomfortable, which was precisely why she did it. "The council has rules," the man continued. "An orc is not a citizen. She can't live without formal registered guardianship." "I'm the guardian. Register it," Edmund said. "You need anything else?" A pause stretched between them. The second man murmured something. The third looked over the farm with the particular attention of someone calculating what it would be worth. "There'll be a meeting in the village next week," the first man said. "The mayor wants to talk. If he wants to talk, he can come here," Edmund replied. "I have work to do." The rider held his ground for a moment, then pulled his reins and turned the horse. The other 2 followed without another word. When the road was quiet again, Shagrat walked over to where Edmund was standing. "You could have gotten out of that," she said. "I wasn't going to do that," he answered. Why? He looked at her. There was something at the bottom of his eyes, not anger, not pity. Something heavier, older. Because it would be wrong, he said simply, and went back inside. Shagrat stayed where she was. She thought about what he'd said. Not the words. The words were plain enough. She thought about the weight behind them. He had said, it would be wrong, the way people say the sky is blue. Not as a statement designed to impress, just as a fact settled long ago. That night, while Edmund slept, she sat at the window of her room and looked at the road, at the dark line of the tree line, at the stars she knew by name from a different life. She thought about going. It would simplify things. For both of them. She disappears, he keeps the farm, the council is satisfied, the village stops talking. But there was still something unresolved. Still the question she hadn't been able to answer in all the weeks she'd been watching him. Why had he come to that sale? Why her? She had no answer, and Shagrat distrusted things without answers. She went back to bed before dawn. But in the morning, before he woke, she swept the porch, drew water from the well, and lit the fire for coffee. That was her answer for now. It was on a cold night that Shagrat came across the photograph on the table. Not for the first time. She had known that photograph since the second day at the farm. It lived on the living room wall in its plain frame, and she had studied it more than once. The dark-haired woman with the restrained smile. The small, serious boy. The two of them posed in front of the house when the fence had been newer. She had memorized it the way she memorized everything important and unexplained. But that night it was on the table. Edmund had taken it down and left it there. She didn't know when. She picked it up in the lamplight. The woman's eyes were clearer up close. The boy had his father's jaw. She was still holding it when Edmund came into the room. He saw it in her hands, saw that she was looking at it. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down without saying anything right away. She set the photograph carefully on the table between them. Your family, she said. She already knew it was. Was, he answered. She let the silence stand for a moment. The war, she asked. He folded his hands on the table, looked at them rather than at her. My wife died of fever 2 years after the war ended, he said. His voice was flat, in the way voices get when they've said something so many times, the saying no longer breaks anything. My son was with a hunting group that was intercepted, out past the ridge. He was 7 years old. Intercepted by who? An Orc clan, he answered, without anger. Just the fact. Shagrat was quiet. Clan Brektar, he continued. They had lost women and children in a battle a few days before, hungry, desperate, full of hatred that didn't choose carefully. The war made that of many people and many clans. It didn't care which side it hollowed out. She knew the Brektar, not personally, but by the shape of their grief. She knew that hunger and hatred together could strip any living creature down to something unrecognizable. She had seen it in orcs. She had felt the edges of it herself. Why did you go get me? She asked. Edmund was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind moved through the trees. Because I woke up one morning, he said slowly, and looked at what I was building inside myself, brick by brick. Hatred for every orc that breathed. As if that was going to give my son back. He stopped. His hands were still on the table, and I realized that if I let that hatred finish me, I would have died with him, just more slowly and for nothing. I went to that sale because I wanted to find out if I was still capable of doing the opposite, he said. If I could choose something different from what the hatred wanted. That was all it was. And could you? She asked. He looked at her then, directly, without the slight guardedness he usually kept. I'm trying, he said. She sat with that. The lamp burned low. There was something in the room that she hadn't felt in a long time. Not safety. She wasn't sure she knew what that felt like anymore. Not gratitude, something rarer. It was the feeling of being told the truth. She went to her room without more words, but lying in the dark. She thought about the Veshran shaman falling in the firelight, about the tents, about everything the war had taken from inside her that she hadn't found a name for yet. And for the first time, she thought that maybe what Edmund was trying to do was the same thing she would need to try too. Not today, but one day. The smoke appeared on the eastern side. It was nearly midnight when Shagrat woke to the smell. She knew it at the cellular level, knew it from the night the Veshran camp burned. Old wood catching flame makes a sound before it makes a smell, and she had heard both at the same moment, there in the shallow end of sleep. She was on her feet before the thought had fully formed. The barn was in flames. She came downstairs running and hit the cold night air at the back door. Edmund was already outside, bucket in hand. But even from where she stood, she could see it was too far gone. The entire back wall was orange and roaring. Not enough water, not enough time. The horse was still inside. She didn't hesitate. "Shagrat," Edmund said, already hearing her footsteps moving the wrong direction. She was at the barn's side door. The heat hit her like a wall. The smoke was low and fast, the kind that takes your vision before it takes your air. She moved through it by memory. She had memorized the layout of that barn in the first week, every plank, every corner, every post. The horse was pressed against the far wall, trembling so hard she could hear it, eyes white and rolling. She spoke to him the way the Veshran had taught, not commands, not soothing nonsense, just presence, low tones. "I'm here, I'm here." The particular calm that said, "I am not afraid, so you don't need to be." His breathing stuttered, then steadied. He let her take the halter. They came through the side door together. The roof gave way 30 seconds after they cleared it. The sound was enormous, a deep crack and then a long roar of settling. The ground shook once. Edmund stood in the yard with the empty bucket in his hand, watching. Shagrat walked the horse to the far end of the field, away from the smell and the light. She stayed with him until some of the trembling went out of him. Then she walked back. 2 men stepped out of the shadows at the tree line. She saw them before Edmund did. "Edmund," she said quietly. He followed her gaze. They stopped when they realized they'd been seen, both carrying torches, not raised, not threatening in posture, but torches in the middle of the night, beside something burning. Shagrat understood immediately what that meant. Edmund walked toward them without hurrying. "That was you," he said. "It wasn't a question." "The whole village thinks what we think," one of them said. Broad man, rough voice. "A free orc is a danger, always has been." "You burned my barn," Edmund said, to frighten me." "To wake you up," the other answered. Shagrat had gone to the side of the house while the horse was still settling and come back with a short hoe handle. Not raised, not threatening, just in her hand. Presence, the sign that she was not the kind of thing that hid when trouble arrived. Both men looked at her. "She's going to attack," the broader one said. "No," Edmund replied without looking back at her. "She's waiting for you to leave." The silence that followed was long enough to matter. The fire crackled and sighed behind them. The broader man looked at Shagrat, then at Edmund, then at the ground. He took a step back. The second man held his position a beat longer, something working behind his eyes. Not bravery, just the slow retreat of stubbornness, encountering something it hadn't expected. Then he stepped back too. "This isn't over," he said. "It was over before it started," Edmund replied. They left. Their footsteps faded into the dark. The barn burned down to embers. Edmund and Shagrat stood in the yard and watched the last flames die, leaving only the deep orange pulse of coals and the smell of burnt wood that would sit in the air for days. The horse was a quiet shape at the far end of the field. Above them, the stars of the iron borderlands were very clear. "Thank you," Edmund said. Shagrat was quiet for a moment. "The horse is a good animal," she said. He looked at her sideways. That expression she had learned to read, his particular way of feeling something he didn't have a ready word for. "You could have gotten hurt." "Could have," she agreed. They stood in the quiet together for a while. Neither spoke. The embers shifted and settled. Then Edmund went inside, and she stayed a little longer, watching the last of the light go out of the coals. The world out there still had men with torches, still had long miles between what was and what could be. She knew that. She had never expected otherwise. But there was also this. Two people from opposite ends of everything, standing in a yard in the dark after a fire, and when it had mattered, neither of them had gone anywhere. In the months that followed, the village grew quieter. The mayor never came. The Frontier Council sent a paper with the guardianship registered. The men with the torches did not return. The barn was rebuilt with better wood than the original. One afternoon, when the new roof was on and the horse was back inside, Edmund asked if she wanted to stay, not as a ward, not as a worker, just stay. "I've left every place I ever had," she said, "or been taken from it. This is the first place that didn't push me out." "Then stay," he said, and that was that. Time moved the way it does when there is presence instead of absence. The garden grew larger than they needed. The horse aged into a quieter version of himself. The Veshran flowers along the southern edge spread into a full row, yellow and steady, blooming each spring without being asked to. And on a morning in late spring, when the sun over the iron borderlands had finally learned to come gently, a child ran through the field, small, quick, with skin the faint warm green of new leaves in good light, and eyes that belonged entirely to herself, not her mother's copper, not her father's grey, but something between that had never existed before. She laughed as she ran, a high, clear sound that scattered the birds from the fence posts. She ran the way children run when they have never been told that running could be dangerous. She didn't know about the war. She didn't know about the pen, or the chains, or the sail. She only knew the farm, the garden, the horse that let her feed him carrots from her open palm, the yellow flowers, the way her father laughed when she surprised him. That was her world. It was enough of one. Shagrat stood on the porch, hands on the railing. Edmund stood beside her. The child hit a patch of long grass and went down in a tumble, rolled twice, and came up laughing harder than before. She looked back at them. "Did you see that?" "Like you," Edmund said. "Like me how?" Shagrat asked. "Falls and gets up without making a fuss." The corners of her mouth moved. A real movement this time. The child ran back across the field and grabbed both their hands, one on each side, without hesitating, the way children take hold of things they have always trusted. She stood between them, catching her breath, looking out at the field she had just crossed. She didn't know it was rare. For her, it was just the world. It had started with a choice, not of force, not of law. Just a man who decided, on an ordinary morning, to do the opposite of what hatred wanted. The world only truly changes when someone decides to do what's right, even when no one else would.